Yeah, we're good.
All right, cool. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the fourth installment of the Fall Faculty Series. Sorry we started a little bit late. We were just getting everything set up so we could live stream it for you. Our presenter this evening is Norma. She has been a Mount Mercy faculty member for 20 years. She's associate professor in the education department. She specializes in literacy education. She teaches courses for prospective teachers. One cool thing that she's involved in, she organizes end of the school year service trips to St. Joseph Indian School in Chamberlain, South Dakota. So her and the education students donate like backpacks and school supplies and books for their library. And over the past five years, they've donated over 600 books to the school library. Tonight, she will present on the lines of three suffragists and the moments that shaped them into the Trailblazers or Troublemakers that made it possible for women to vote in America. So, Norma, thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. Good evening. I hope everybody's doing fine. This evening I'm going to be giving an overview of the women's movement for obtaining the vote. And I'm also going to be involving you as the audience, so it's a little bit of audience participation. Since I'm a teacher, I'd like to get students involved in that. So we're going to start off with a non-graded type quiz. And so, did all women really get the vote in 1920? And there's like 4 questions, and so think about the answers, and then I'll be explaining that. The goal of the women's suffrage movement was to secure the right to vote for all women. True or false? How many of you think it's true? a lot of factions that were kind of vying for trying to get this vote passed. They had to kind of think about and eventually let go of suffrage for everyone, the right to vote for everyone. So, especially the Southern women, they were also aligning themselves at times with groups that were not in favor of freedom for slaves and the right for all humans to be able to vote in the American democracy. And so we're going to learn a little bit more about that. The second question is, the 19th Amendment made women's suffrage the law of the land. But what year did the first United States state give women the right to vote? So states were allowed to ratify their own laws about whether women should be given the right to vote. And individual states, different dates where they were allowed to vote on this issue. And so the answer is A. The United States did put the voting in the hands of women, except New Jersey was really one of the first ones to include all women. So in 1776, we had the Constitution ratified, we became our own country. And at that time, while there was a lot of talk about the women not getting the vote, there was one state, New Jersey, who allowed them. There's actual evidence that they were allowed. So everyone else lost the vote except the men. So when the Constitution came about, it was the fact that men, it said all free inhabitants, including women, and the only state to allow that was New Jersey. And the women were able to vote for quite some time. But other states did not. The next question is, which of the following was an actual argument made in the 1800s against giving the women the right to vote? These are kind of interesting. The polls are not decent places for women at present. So that's why they should not be allowed to vote. A woman who takes proper care of her household has no time to learn anything about politics. Women, after all, are silly creatures. I should not wish to hear my wife speak in town meeting. Which of these were actually used against women and their ability to vote? A, B, C, or D? Whichever one you chose, they were all correct. Women were not allowed to vote for various reasons, and some of those reasons we just identified. Whether they had a basis for them or not, they still were some of the reasons that were given for why women couldn't vote. And the last question is, who really won the right to vote with the ratification of the 19th Amendment? All women? Women over the age of 35? Women of color? Or white women? The answer is that technically the 19th Amendment applied to all women, but in reality it was the white women who were able to benefit from that. There were still certain groups, African Americans, we also had Native and Asian Americans who women were not allowed to vote. They won their right depending on immigration laws and other citizenship laws that eventually started giving these groups citizenship. I thought that was kind of a good way to kind of get us thinking about the movement and some of the things that might have propelled it. I'm going to share with you a very brief timeline of the movement. So we found out that when the 13 colonies won their independence, they eventually put together the Constitution and ratified that. And in that process, when they were writing the Constitution, Abigail Adams told her husband, who was part of the Constitutional Congress, when she was she would write to him letters because he was off, making big decisions and working toward gaining America's independence. She wrote him a letter, and in that letter, she pleaded for him to remember the ladies. She was wanting the women. If the men were getting freedom from England and they were going to become a free nation, an independent nation from England, women were already asking for the right to be part of this new country and to take part in it in all aspects. And so she wrote to him and she said, please remember the ladies. She wanted women to have the same rights as men. And obviously, as we know, that didn't happen in all states, because if the Constitution gave the power to the states to decide whether women should have the right to vote or not. So it became a very individualized process, which each state had to make those determinations on their own. Okay, so we're going to fast forward to the 1800s, and this is kind of like the beginnings of organized efforts by women to come together, and it was associated with other aspects of colonial life and life in America. And so in 1840s, we're going to see that the women are going to organize themselves. They're going to be part of an abolitionist movement. They're going to be seeking the freedom for enslaved people. And in that process, they start to think about their own station in life. They start to look at themselves and to say, well, if we want people to be free and we want enslaved people to be free, we as women who are working in an effort to make sure that everyone is free, they wanted freedom for themselves too. So there were two women who became really crucial during this time, and I'm going to be talking about them a little bit later on. In 1870, the United States ratified the amendment. It happened to be the 15th Amendment. And that amendment said that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, the ladies were against this amendment. They fought against this amendment because while it looks good, it was definitely going to be used as a wedge to keep the women from voting. What this 15th Amendment is saying is that we're going to give enslaved people the right to vote. So that meant that they would get the right to vote before the women did. But we know historically, even though they ratified this amendment to the Constitution, that there were going to be a lot of roadblocks put in its place, the Jim Crow laws and other laws that are going to keep poll taxes and literacy tests in order for free blacks in America to be able to vote. And then we fast forward a little bit more to the 1890s leading up to the 1920s. We have some women that were very important to the process. And tonight I'm going to focus on Elizabeth Caddie Stanton as one. I'm going to briefly talk about the others in their process, but Elizabeth Caddie Stanton was one of those women who organized other women in an effort to help to free enslaved people. And she had some other helpers that came along, and eventually these women became the leaders of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And so these are the leaders that took over that organization throughout this time span and led the women to eventually win the right to vote. Some of these names are familiar to you. They were the presidents of this organization that eventually won the right to vote. And they used particular tactics and methods for doing that. We also know that Susan B. Anthony is actually credited with a lot of that. Her statue stands in this honorary hall where all the statues are. She's one of those women who is has her own statue there, and so she is one that we really kind of associate with that, because she was really the organizer. She was the one that promoted Elizabeth Caddie Stanton to do the hard work. Elizabeth had been well educated, and she was very affable, likable. She had a great personality, and so she's going to, she's a great writer and a great speaker. And not that Susan Anthony was not, she was, but she was more focused on making sure that she prompted someone who had more of that ability to interact. She had a lot of social intelligence. She worked well with a lot of people. And Susan would give her all the statistics and all the data that she needed and all the arguments that she needed to be able to go out there and gain a following. And then there was Carrie Chapman Catt, and she came along too, and she took over the organization with the other two ladies who were the originators and founders of this organization. As they were getting older, they kind of stepped back a bit, and so Caddie Chapman Catt took over at that point. And then they had a period, and this is Caddie Chapman Catt, okay? And she also was a woman who was very well educated, traveled well among different groups of people. She spoke well, and she was very well liked as well. While she was married, while she was working in this movement, her husband passed away. And at that time, she decided to step back. And another individual came up in the ranks, and that was Anne Howard Shaw. And she took the organization over for the next 3 or 4 years. And in that process, you know, the women's movement kind of got a little bit unfocused, or they weren't as organized and they weren't going out there as much as they used to. And so under her reign as the president of that organization, eventually some of the finances to the group began to suffer. She wasn't as attentive to, you know, mobilizing and getting the resources where they needed to be. And so after a few years, after Carrie's husband had passed, she came back into the organization, and she's the one that continued to move forward with the movement. And so here's a picture of Anne Howard Shaw. And so then Caddie came back. And so we're going to find out also that some of the women are not going to be around to see or to cast their first votes. The originators of this movement were not able to see that. But the legacy is that women now can vote, so we thank you for that. Well, you would think, you know, now, because we have everybody can vote, that it would be, you know, what was the reason behind women not being given the right to vote? And so, historically, if we go back, and, you know, I didn't want to go too far back, but I just wanted to bring some understanding as to why even some women were against the right for women to vote. And this was kind of based on the principle of religion. They saw God and the Bible as driving a blueprint for how people should interact, what their positions are and what their roles are in society. And so those kind of seem to drive that. And because they were using as part of the argument that women should not get the right to vote, they would go back into certain passages of the Bible. And one of them was from Ephesians, and it was, "Wife, submit to your own husband as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of all of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior." And so here was, wives, you are to submit to your husband's rules and guidelines, okay? In Timothy, he also says the following: "Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet." And so when you're looking for arguments as to why women should vote, the Bible was used as one that said why they shouldn't vote. So you're going to have these two forces kind of coming together and trying to resolve, this. So women's role in society was pretty much set, taking it from not only biblical, but also from other writings of other individuals. So the woman was looked at as being the mother, and the wife, and the caregiver. And we have lots of images in our history books that kind of reinforce that. And women had this role as to being quiet. They were not allowed to speak their mind. They were usually separated from the men. And the men would talk about the business, the affairs of, the places where they lived, the communities in which they lived. They talked about and took care of those needs without the interjection of the women. And so you have years of a blueprint on how we are supposed to interact and what our roles are. But there was no equality under the law. And some women were being educated. Some families wanted to educate their young women beyond the initial schooling that was given to young girls. So in colonial times, young women were allowed to go to school probably up to 3rd grade. If they were lucky, they might go up to maybe a 6th grade. They were taught how to cook, how to sew, how to take basic affairs of like bookkeeping and making sure that everything was fine with the finances of the running of the home. And so they were not equal in education unless a family chose to send a daughter further beyond the very basics of an education. They were also not allowed to speak their minds in public. It was scandalous and outrageous for women to do that, to voice their opinions. They could also not own property. And that was very difficult for women when there were no other heirs. And if there were other heirs, they were supposed to give the male their inheritance. And so women were not allowed to own property. And women who were thinking about what was going on and hearing stories from other women started to question why these things were such. If they were married, and if things didn't work out, they were also not allowed to divorce. So if it was not a good situation, they had to continue in the marriage. Possibly, arrangements could be made. But if they did divorce, they were not allowed to take custody of their own children. It was the men who took the children. And the woman was pushed aside. And so when things happened in these communities and things weren't working out, they would hear these stories from these women, and many of them were enraged by this. They could also not minister to others. If a woman felt called, that God was calling them to be a minister, to share what they felt about their religious beliefs, and to, try to evangelize others into their religion, they were not allowed to do that. In addition, if they were such that they were young and were able to work and bring money back to their original family, that they would only be allowed to work in servitude kinds of positions. So they would become nannies, they would become, maids and clean and sew and iron. If a particular family was wealthy enough, they would have enough money to bring in help. And so there were very strict ways of being in the world, walking in the world as a female. I love this woodcut. It's a woodcut because as the movement started to, as religious women would go to church, and they would see that they did not approve of the enslavement of people, they started to make the connections between people who were enslaved and the fact that they also didn't have rights. And so she's looking at this, all the rungs on the ladder, and she's feeling like she's enslaved because all that she can do is take care of all the home, the everyday ins and outs of the home. However, as society evolved and we began to engage ourselves in different wars, sometimes women were called to take the place of the man because the man was out at war. And so these women entered into the workforce for short periods of time. And they saw, and were able to engage in work outside of the house. And for some, that made them feel very productive, as if they were able to contribute back to the cause of whatever might be going out in terms of conflicts. Eventually, as they started to be able to go out and get jobs, they were jobs where they could become teachers, they could become clerks, possibly bookkeepers and stenographers. There was nursing. Nursing was a good field for women to go into. They could become secretaries. They could do anything in the arts and crafts kind of world. You could become a painter. Those kinds of positions were very much ones that were approved eventually, okay? And so as you can see, she's looking up and she's saying, okay, these are the things that I can do. I can probably become a teacher. I can work in my church and, be engaged in charities that my church is organizing and putting together. And finally, she's looking, it's probably time that I got my equal rights. I want to be able to vote and participate because I don't want to be limited to these particular careers. And so women started to see that other women were starting to break the mold. And they were not satisfied completely with the way things work. And so you're going to get women who want to stay in the traditional roles that they had, and other women who don't. And you would think that all people would be thinking of one mind, but they aren't, because we're all individual, and that's okay. And so the debate is going to rage in the streets of America. And so my attention tonight is going to look at Caddie Stanton, Elizabeth Caddie Stanton. And because she is the foundress, she's one of those individuals that started the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And I wanted to tell you just a little bit about her parents and her background, and kind of give you a feel into her personality, because it is important to see whether what she experiences leads her to become a trailblazer or a troublemaker in some eyes, especially when you have two sides thinking women should have the right to vote and others are thinking no. She describes her parents as, they're Scottish, and they were Scottish immigrants to the United States or Scottish background. And she talks of her mother very kindly. She says her mother was tall and queenly, very stately. She was very composed, and she was self-reliant, and she described her as being very courageous. And she also spoke of her father very fondly. She said her father, who was a judge and well respected in the community, had a firm character, and he had high integrity, that he believed in his principles. And so this begins to form her as a young woman. In addition to that, I wanted to tell you that, and share a little bit from what I read about her. When Elizabeth Caddie Stanton was 11 years old, something happened that started to change her. It was at 11 that she came home to find her only brother, who had just graduated from Union College, had arrived and was preparing to die. He was sickly and ill. This is going to form her as a person who is going to try to fill in his shoes. A young man of great talent and promise, he was the pride of my father's heart, she writes, because she was so well educated. This is a book that she wrote about her life. She was a prolific writer, and that was her great force, a prolific writer and a great orator, a great speaker. And she will eventually make this relationship with Susan B. Anthony. She says, a young man of great talent and promise, he was the pride of my father's heart. We early felt that this son filled a large space in my father's affections and future plans than the 5 daughters together. So she had, she had 4 sisters and herself and her brother. Well do I remember how tenderly my father watched my brother in his last illness, the sighs and tears he gave vent to as he slowly walked up and down the hall. And when the last sad moment came, and we were all assembled to say farewell in the silent chamber of death, how broken were his utterances as he knelt and prayed for comfort and support. So this is going to make a great impact. She sees that her father is broken. It's the only son of the family to take on the name and to take on, and to become the heir. And she says, I still recall, too, going into the large darkened parlor to see my brother and finding the casket, mirrors, and pictures all draped in white, and my father seated by his side, pale and immovable. As he took no notice of me after standing a long while, I climbed upon his knee, where he mechanically put his arm around me, and with my head resting against his beating heart, we both sat in silence, he thinking of the wreck of all his hopes in the loss of my dear brother, and I wondering what could be said or done to fill his sad and void heart. At length he heaved a deep sigh and said, "Oh, my daughter, I wish you were a boy." It is going to move her to great efforts to try to fill that void. And so she continues to, mourn the loss of her brother, and eventually she comes up with this brilliant idea. And she says, I am going to do everything in my power Throwing my arms around my father's neck, I replied, I will try to be all my brother was. And that sets her on a path. To think like a boy, to act like a boy, to get educated like a boy, to ride a horse like a boy, to do and fill the shoes of his brother. And it's really quite remarkable. She decided, because her brother was so well educated, that she was going to go ahead and follow in his footsteps. He had studied, Latin and Greek and gone to university, and she was going to do the same. And so for 3 years, and so she was very saddened by this as well, because she said, now how can I do this? And she says, I'm not a boy. How am I going to do this? So she goes to the local doctor, who is also a minister, Reverend Simon Hosak, and she talks to him, and she pours out her heart to him. And she says, Doctor, which do you like best, boys or girls? And the doctor replies, why, girls, to be sure. I would not give you for all the boys in Christendom. Wow. So while this was a pivotal moment for her, another man is going to give confidence that she's going to need and the education that she's going to need. Because she says, okay, my father prefers boys. He wishes I was one, and I intend to be as near like one as possible. I'm going to ride on horseback and study Greek. Will you give me a Greek lesson? Now, and so he does. And for the next 3 years, she dedicates herself to being the best that she can. She is allowed to go to school, and she begins to compete with boys at school. There is one particular young man who is vying for and is very good in Greek, and she sets her eyes on him, and she wants to beat him. And so for 3 years, she says, one boy kept his place at the head of the class, and I always stood next. 2 prizes were offered in Greek. I strove for one and took the second. She said, how well I remember my joy in receiving that prize. And then she goes to her father with that prize with all this beaming, exuberant joy from having achieved this great honor. And he is interested, the father is interested, and shows interest in her and asks her about it. And then his last words to her. And while I stood looking and waiting for him to say something to me, which would show that he recognized the equality of a daughter with a son, that's what she wanted more than anything. She said, he kissed me on the forehead and exclaimed with a sigh, ah, but you should have been a boy. And so with that, she is educated. She goes on to educate herself. Her parents allow her to be educated. And eventually she meets Caddie Stanton. And Henry is, he's an abolitionist. And he is very well respected. And he is asked to speak at different gatherings, to speak about the freedom for enslaved people. And she's very much attracted to that. And so they become very good friends. And eventually he proposes to her, but then she recants because she's focused on wanting to get freedom, not only for enslaved people, because she believes in the same things that he does, but she also wants her own freedom. And so she doesn't want the trappings of becoming a wife, because she's afraid that all of the preconceived notions of what women should be are going to fall upon her. And so while he proposes, she accepts, and then she backs out. And it's not until later that she goes to a vacation place in New York, and she thinks about it, and she talks about it, and she comes to a decision that, they are of like minds, that he is respectful of her, and that she is going to move forward. And so she decides to marry him. And in that process, pretty soon he is asked to go and speak at the World Convention for Abolitionists, the freedom of enslaved people. And she's so proud, and she's so excited. And they get married a week before they have to take off on a ship to England. And so she decides that she is going to do this very quickly. She says she gets married in a very simple dress, no big frills or anything, and then a week later off they go. They sail across the Atlantic. And at that time, when they end up reaching England, he is very good friends with James Mott, and his wife is very progressive. She thinks that women should have the right to vote, and she has, but she's really more focused on the abolitionist movement. She is an abolitionist, and she believes in freedom for others. And they spend 6 weeks in England, and they are supposed to allow the women to speak. And Elizabeth gets very, very excited because she wants to speak, and so does Lucretia Mott. They're both she looks to Lucretia as a person who is a role model for her. She admires her forward thinking, her eloquence in speaking, and that she is respected by her husband. And they are thinking they're going to get a chance to talk. They're going to say why they want freedom for enslaved people. And the women are supposed to get a chance to talk, and the men put a kibosh. The abolitionists who do not believe that women should have the right to vote. And this just lights a fire under Caddie Stanton. And she says, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that this has happened. And they then decide that on the way back, when they get home, they're going to show those men, they're going to come up with the women's right movement. And the women's right movement are going to focus on political, economic, and social justice for women, in addition to wanting to the freedom for enslaved people. So, as you can see, she is definitely on her way. They decide when they get back, it takes them a bit to get themselves organized, and they want to see if there is interest, and there certainly is interest. And they decide to hold the women's right movement in 1848. There's going to be abolitionists there, obviously, because a lot of the women who are looking for rights for enslaved people are also going to be looking for rights for women. There's a group of them that do not believe in that, always, so we have to keep that in mind. And there's also prohibitionists that are going to be part of that convention. And it is Caddie Stanton and Lucretia Mott who go to Seneca Falls and do this. And in the process, they do something very bold that Lucretia doesn't have the guts to do, but Caddie Stanton does. And she writes up this beautiful article. It's called the Declaration of Sentiments. And this Declaration of Sentiments, this movement is going to be the birth of what we now would know as the women's suffrage movement. And this declaration was so bold that Lucretia Mott is worried that they are going to lose followers. And so here we have the Women's Right Convention. You'll see that Lucretia Mott is the first person listed, and these are women who want women's rights in political, social, and economic spheres of our society. And you'll see Caddie Stanton is listed as the fourth person there. And so, as part of this, they have a Declaration of Sentiments. And this is where they kind of lay out their reasons for wanting to vote. And so there is a copy of it. You can go online and find it if you're interested. But here are the reasons that they give for why women should have the right to vote. They are saying, you know, it's the foundation of all political liberty. we obey the law. And if we obey the law as women, then we should be part of the law. Also said, laws affect women as much as men. As a matter of fact, most of the laws that are made about women and the household and the running of it because of, and so she says, it affects women more than it does men. If you have like social services and all of these things, so she's making these connections and these arguments as to why they deserve it. She also says that many times the laws that affect them are passed without even their consent or even their ability to voice their views on these laws. And there's a whole litany of reasons why. And so the last one says, to sum up all of the reasons in one, it is for the common good of all that women should have the right to vote. And so they set this out. It's bold, it's shocking, it's read across the nation. People are in shock. People start to actually rally against them, and others start to rally for them. But the cat's out of the bag. There's no going back now. Women are starting to think. So Elizabeth Caddie Stanton does become the president of the Women's Organization for Suffrage. At the time, she's 75 years old. I'm going to show a short little video clip. It is about 3 minutes long. Hopefully it'll come up. And I think this sums it up pretty well.
While she is slow and analytical in composition, I am rapid in synthetic. I am the better writer, she the better critic. She supplied the facts and statistics, I the philosophy and rhetoric. And together, we have made arguments that have stood unshaken by the storms of 30 long years. Arguments that no man has answered. Elizabeth Caddie Stanton. Elizabeth Caddie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were born 4 years and 71 miles apart into a world ruled entirely by men. But by the time their lives were over, they would have changed for the better the lives of the majority of American citizens. They could not have been more different. Stanton was born to wealth and comfort, was married and mother of 7 children. She was witty and hospitable, fond of good food and fine clothes. But she was also an uncompromising revolutionary, a many-ideaed woman, her daughter called her, who dared proclaim to the world that women had the right to vote. Anthony was plain-spoken, single-minded, disciplined, born a Quaker. She chose not to marry. She was a brilliant strategist, willing to tack to the left or to the right, if by so doing she could steer the woman's suffrage movement closer to its goal. Though she never held public office, she would become the nation's first great woman politician, Aunt Susan to a whole generation of young women. Despite their differences, the two would work together for more than half a century to better the lives of women everywhere.
The combination of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Caddie Stanton is one of the great miracles in the history of our country. You cannot imagine a suffrage movement, cannot imagine the push to get women equal rights without these two women leading the fray. It just wouldn't have happened.
They are women's history of the 19th century. There is no women's history. There would be no women's history without them. They created the movement. They gave it its vitality. They gave it its life. And they carried it.
So that kind of gives us a window into these two women, and they what one had and the other one, what one didn't have, the other one had. So together, their forces were unstoppable. And while they were not privy to actually casting the vote because they died before that, they are given the credit that they deserve for being these revolutionary women who did not give up through the many years that they fought for this right. There are pictures of women marching, and women were put in jail. Some of them went on hunger strikes, and they were force-fed. They were not allowed to go hungry. And so there are pictures that we see about these women who were not going to give up. And they were going to continue until they got to where they needed to be. There's another quick video. I want to watch at least part of it, even though it's just 3 minutes, because I want you to see that there were people who were around still when they filmed this. They were growing up as young girls, and they got to see their mothers fight for women's rights to vote. And so I do want to share that with you.
We've been taking the environment for granted for a long time.
Nature is fundamentally essential to our future existence.
Explore the vital connection between humans and nature.
In this new era, we can restore ecosystems.
And the people making positive change for the planet.
We need nature to survive on this planet.
Discover new solutions.
I can't think of a more inspirational story.
For a better future. The Age of Nature. Now streaming only on PBS.
My mother was a suffragette. She and her friends held meetings. I think that I was about 15. All the women that had been involved in it were marching up and down Beacon Hill, right to the bottom of Beacon Hill, with crowds looking at us. It was not the only march. I mean, women were marching all over. This was our big time to get people, to encourage people, to get them into the movement.
I knew about the women's suffragettes, but remember, in those days, women were in the kitchen. In those days, women were in the home. Men did the voting. They let them do the voting. They weren't interested. I remember the women's suffragettes. They seemed rather bold and unladylike to venture out into the world. There was a woman in Cold Spring Harbor. She rode a white horse all the way to Albany, trying to educate people along the way on why women should have the vote. And that's what impressed me very much. They were a little bit unladylike, but when we got the vote, we were thankful to them. But we had to wake up too.
On November 2nd, 1920, for the first time in history, more than 8 million American women went to the polls and exercised their right to vote in precincts all over America. Thomas Jefferson had proclaimed equality the bedrock of American government, but it had taken 144 years for women finally to achieve full citizenship in the United States. And the two women who had fought longest for women's rights, Elizabeth Caddie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, had not lived long enough to cast a ballot themselves.
And so, just to conclude, I would like to say that I'm very grateful, for some of the women who were forward-looking. I could probably still be a teacher. We were still going by the old roles that women could play. But, I think that we have come a long way, and there's still a long way to go in all aspects for all people, because we want all human beings to be free and to continue to prosper, and those are the things that we continue to strive for, because it's not over yet. If we take a look at voter suppression now, as we are in this election season, there are many misconceptions about who can vote, where to go vote, or whether your vote is going to count or not. I think it's important for us to remember that there are people who are wanting to make sure that every vote counts. And so I do urge you and everyone out there to go and vote, because people have fought battles to get the right to vote for different groups. And so with that, I will end. I did want to say that I think that the way that we approach the teaching of history and social studies, if we focus more on the people, sometimes we get so wrapped up in the dates and, battles and, conventions, names, and all of that. But when you really look inside to see the people who make these differences, we can inspire the next generation to do greater things, because we can see the personalities. Are they troublemakers, or are they trailblazers? And I leave that in your hands to make the decision. I only presented some information, and I hope that you will make your own decisions on that. And I think if we did justice to history and presented it in this form, where we look at the people in all their complexities, that we will see that it is important to know our history, because it allows us to go forward into the future. Thank you very much. I do want to thank the librarians for helping me amass some of these different sources. I did bring some to share with the audience. I also want to thank my friend Nancy Merriman, because she also helped me with some sources as well. And I bounced ideas off of her. And I want to thank my family, who puts up with me every day. Thank you very much. Good evening.
If anyone has questions or comments, you're welcome to share them. And for folks live streaming, you can put your comments into the comments section, and we can share them right here.
Hold on, Linda. So, knowing when Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth did, when they had passed away, did they write anything where they felt where that movement was going, whether or not they felt that they were going to be at least somewhat successful down the line? Because it wasn't until, still, more than a decade later.
And Joe, thank you for that question, because he's asked whether if Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Caddie Stanton had an inkling of whether they were actually going to one day be able to get the vote. I can tell you that they were very hopeful. I don't have actual quotes from that, but I know that they were hopeful because they believed in, humanity, and they knew this was right in the deepest parts of them. They knew that this was the right thing to do. But I don't know. I thought that they were very hopeful. They were very hopeful human beings. They knew that someday this would happen. We just didn't get the chance to see it. And you're right, Joe, because actually the right to vote was won by one vote. A young man, his mother called him. The vote was tide, the boats were coming in, people were looking at the boats, and one young man's mother called him, and he was going to cast his vote against the women. And she called him that morning and she said, "You had better do the right thing, son, for your mother and for all the women in your life." It was passed by a window. So you're right, it was teetering on the fact that it could have gone another 12 years, for goodness sake. Okay, any other questions? Thank you.
All right, cool. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everybody.